All right, good evening everyone, and welcome to the Marian Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Bruno Yoon, and I'm one of the Athenaeum Fellows this year. Virtually all of us know that we can't be thinking 24/7. That's why we have things like mindless TV, like Bachelor in Paradise. Most of us need mindlessness from time to time. If you don't, though, just know that I both envy and admire you. But politics is something where you have to think a lot. Mindlessness plus politics intuitively equals utter disaster. Enter fascism, which is what this talk is about. Susan Sontag once wrote that what fascism stands for, besides brutishness and terror, as we all know very well, it also stands for, I quote, the cult of beauty, the fetishism of courage, the dissolution of alienation and ecstatic feelings of community, the repudiation of the intellect, the family of man under the parenthood of leaders. This captures it pretty well. Ecstatic feelings of community, repudiation of the intellect, the family of man under the parenthood of leaders. So it's a community where you don't have to think because you're just mindlessly following authority. We have a 4-letter word for all of that. It's right in the quote, a cult. And we are seeing a lot of cult-like behavior in politics, certainly here, also in Brazil, Turkey, the Philippines, elsewhere too. Anyway, a lot of us are probably wondering, why do people with otherwise perfectly functioning brains fall into this? Our speaker tonight, Jason Stanley, is here to help us figure out the answer to that question, among others. Stanley is the Jacob Urowski Professor of Philosophy at Yale University. Before that, he was Distinguished Professor in the Department of Philosophy at Rutgers and a professor at the University of Michigan and Cornell. He earned his PhD from the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy at MIT and his bachelor's from the State University in New York at Stony Brook. He's written several books, the latest of which is How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them. It's for sale in the lobby as you walk out. Another is How Propaganda Works, which I know some of you in the audience have read. Professor Stanley's Athenaeum presentation is the 2018 Globalists Lecture and is sponsored by the Gould Center for Humanistic Studies. By the way, there's a study that came out recently by some of the world's top political scientists seeking to better understand why democracy is especially imperiled today, particularly by fascism. They discovered something groundbreaking. There's a very strong relationship between the risk of democratic collapse and two different things. One, cell phone usage at socially inappropriate times, and audio and visual recording of events that should not be recorded. They didn't fully prove causality, but just to be safe, please silence and put away your cell phones. And recording audio and visual is strictly prohibited, just to be safe. If you haven't adjusted your seat, please do so now. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jason Stanley.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be here and giving the Golo Man lecture, which last year was given by Adam Michnik, I think, someone I greatly admire. So in 2010, I spent about 20 years as a philosopher working on topics like the left parentheses and the semicolon. No piece of punctuation was safe from my gaze. And in 2009, I went to this wonderful university in Budapest, Central European University, where I taught a 2-week course on the word if. And it was very exciting. There were 50 people took the course, graduate students and junior faculty from all around the country. We talked 6 hours a day about the word if and wandered through the beautiful streets of Budapest and the new shining liberal Europe's new shining liberal democracy in the great university, Central European University, founded by George Soros. I returned in 2010 to teach another course on the theory of meaning. And the mood in Budapest had turned somber. I was walking on the streets with a Hungarian friend, and I saw a poster with Saint Stephen, the patron saint of Hungary, standing holding a menorah over the map of Hungary. And I said, "What is that?" And my friend says, "What does it say?" And my friend says, "It says, Hungary will not become another Palestine." The mood had changed in Hungary. Viktor Orban had come to power on a harshly illiberal platform. The next year, he passed a new constitution for the country of Hungary in 2011, the fundamental law, whose preamble reads that the Constitution will allow the children of Hungary to make Hungary, the next generation, to make Hungary great again. That summer in 2010, many Hungarians, or a number of Hungarians I met, seemed to be obsessed with Trianon. And I was like, what the hell is Trianon? And it's a treaty, it was the treaty that lost Greater Hungary. And people were like obsessed with it. It'd been filled, the politics was filled with like, we once were great, and then we lost Greater Hungary. I was like, that was quite some time ago. Get over it. But yet, even the people opposed to Orbán were saying, well, we were very proud to have Greater Hungary. Viktor Orbán's fundamental law promises to make the relationship between the patriarchal family, the relationship between fathers and between man and wife, the center of Hungarian culture again. And then in today's New York Times today, announced the closing of Central European University in Budapest, the greatest university in Hungary, perhaps the greatest university in Eastern Europe. So we now see in our own country George Soros being attacked in the very same vocabulary, with the very same methods that he was attacked there. Central European University has been attacked for the last 8 years as a bastion of liberalism. 1 week ago, Hungary illegalized the teaching of gender studies classes. The Hungarian ministry said gender studies is an ideology, it's not a science. Masha Gessen, in her 2017 book, writes about the targeting of universities across Eastern Europe as being dens of Marxists, liberals, feminists, and leftist ideology. We find these attacks in our own country as well. We find universities being painted as bastions of liberalism and leftism, as dangerous ideological factories of training the youth. So these are no longer attacks that center in Eastern Europe. And they never really were, as Masha Gessen has explained at length in her work. In my book, How Fascism Works, I talk about how in 2013, Pat McCrory, governor of North Carolina, said, then governor of North Carolina, said, taxpayers of North Carolina will not pay for gender studies or Swahili anymore. Swahili is a language spoken by over 110 million people as a first or second language, more than Italian. I wonder why he chose Swahili. European University of St. Petersburg, one of the best, perhaps the best university other than Moscow State in Russia, was closed down because of gender studies. What is going on? What is going on? Why gender studies? Why liberals? Why the fear of Marxists? These are signs that a certain kind of politics is taking over. When there's panic about liberals, globalists. This is my topic today, and I'm carrying this out in a university because the universities are one of the bastions, one of the places where we have to discuss. We have to have free discussion, and we're one of the targets. We're one of the targets of this politics. We're being told that our places don't allow, are tearing down the nationalist traditions. So there's no room for national pride. They're dens of leftist indoctrination. So we're at the center of these battles. So what I'm going to talk to you today is, fascist politics. I'm not going to talk fascist politics and ideology. I'm not going to talk about fascist government. For one thing, it's not my expertise. And for another thing, I don't think that fascist government, I'm skeptical that there is one thing, fascist government. Fascism is an ideology that is centered on power, loyalty, and fear of the other. And what you do in fascism is you use certain tactics to take over. Now, what happens when you take over turns out to be quite diverse. You know, we can use the Nazis as an example, as a terrifying example of fascism, but there are much less terrifying examples of fascism. There are examples where people used fascist politics to do different things. You know, in Bradley Hart's new book, Hitler's American Friends, he shows that in the 1930s, you had a very strongly fascist movement here, and the hope he shows the Germans, the Nazis, were very well aware of this. The hope that Charles Lindbergh would emerge as an American Hitler. But it wouldn't have been the same thing. It would no doubt not have been as brutal. Lindbergh was horrifically racist, but he wasn't calling for the extermination of people. He was calling for the white race to be the master race, but he wasn't calling to kill, you know, Jews or to kill non-whites. He was calling just for the white race to raise its walls. I begin with a Lindbergh passage, How Fascism Works, with a Lindbergh passage. The fascist movement in England was not as violent as the Nazi fascist movement. Mussolini wasn't, you know, genocide was not central to Mussolini's aim. So when we think about the Nazis, we're thinking about marrying fascism together with, you know, Hitler's extremely intense anti-Semitism. But if we do that, then we don't recognize the ways in which we are vulnerable and the ways in which we were implicated in European fascism. So there's a number of recent books that have covered the topic of America's influence on European fascism. It dates back to Nancy MacLean's 1994 Behind the Mask of Chivalry, where she talks about the effects and connections between the KKK and European fascist movements, very ideologically similar. My colleague Jim Whitman's book, Hitler's American Model, sketches how the Nuremberg lawyers took as their model our anti-miscegenation laws, our Jim Crow laws, which were considered the world over as incredibly radical and extreme. After all, the United States most states banned marriages between whites and blacks, where a black person was anyone with one drop of black blood. Something that the Nazis thought was just absurd and decided on 1/8. You're Jewish if you're 1/8. So the United States was an extreme example for the world of white supremacy. The 1924 Immigration Act is repeatedly praised in Hitler's work. And Mein Kampf is an argument for a national state, for what Hitler calls a national state, a nation, to break down the bureaucratic state, to break down the administrative state and replace it by a state based on national identity. And what is Hitler's model? Hitler's model, at one point, Hitler says, there's no pure model I have, but one nation promises to be the model, and that is the nation across the sea, the United States of America. He begins this passage by saying, our immigration laws are the mockery of the world. They're ludicrous. Everyone in the world looks at our immigration laws and laughs. And then he says, but there's one nation we can emulate that is beginning the process of becoming a national state in the way I'm defending here. And that is I do not mean our pattern German Republic, whose immigration laws make it a mockery of the world. I mean the United States, and he's referring to the 1924 Immigration Act, which bans immigration except from a select few countries, meaning Norway, Northern Europe, and is very strict about immigration from a health point of view. The 1924 Immigration Act restricts immigration also not just on national identity, but also on the basis of health, which we're talking about yet again. So he says the United States is just, one might say that what Hitler is saying is the United States is banning immigration from what he regarded as perhaps shithole countries and only accepts immigration from places like Norway. That's basically what he's saying. So the United States is not, when we think about fascism, we think about Europe, but I don't think we should. I think we should think about something that happens in every country. That's something that is a human tendency. There's a human inclination to find this kind of politics powerful. I think fascism in its contemporary modern form requires a kind of nationalism from the 19th century. So it requires a kind of strict nationalism. But fascism, the general ideology that I'm going to describe, is something that political philosophers have been discussing since Plato. So the Republic, Plato's Republic, is a response to a figure, Thrasymachus. And Thrasymachus argues that all is power, that all there is power, that virtue is weakness, and justice is weakness, and all is power. That the way it should be is most powerful person rules, and morality is for the weak, and value just goes with winning. And all of Plato's Republic is a response to Thrasymachus. And Plato, in Book 8, of course, the famous Book 8, when he talks about how democracy will lead immediately to tyranny, he talks about how a leader will come and sow fear of one group and represent himself as the protector of the people. And he says that democracy because it is freedom of speech. It allows demagogues to engage in this kind of rhetoric, will always fall prey to a Thrasymachus type of figure, and democracy will lead immediately to tyranny. But what Plato's trying to do overall in the Republic is he's trying to defend truth and justice against power. And that's the ultimate, and whether you're a liberal Democrat like myself, or whether you're Plato, who is no fan of democracy, what you're responding to is an ideology that's just based on power, just based on winning. The idea is value comes from strength and winning. And truth is in opposition to that because no one of us has special access to truth. Truth levels out power, right? Because if truth sets out the rules, then you might be much wealthier than I am, but I can point out that you're wrong. And so truth is our weapon against power. Now, my favored system is liberal democracy, which has two values, liberty and equality. And both liberty and equality require truth. I'm going to try not to mess this up because at the last talk I gave, when I did this, I said, nobody thinks the citizens of North Carolina are free, and then where I meant North Korea. And so like 10 minutes later, I realized I had said North Carolina, but nobody blinked, so let me not mess this one up. Nobody thinks the citizens of North Korea are free. Why don't we think the citizens of North Korea are free? Because they've been lied to. And since they've been lied to, what they're doing is not under their control. When they do something, they don't know why they're doing it. They think they're doing it for certain reasons, because the dear leader is this or that. But, that's not why they're doing it. They've been lied to. The dear leader is not that. It's not all that. So they're not free. We don't think of people who are operating on lies as free. Liberty requires freedom. Similarly, equality requires freedom. In liberal democracy, equality is political equality. Liberal democracy tolerates differences in wealth, differences in material possessions, but it requires political equality. It requires that we're all equal on the political stage, that each of us has a voice and can speak to each other. and can refute each other in argument. And political equality requires truth. It requires speaking truth to power. So that's what political equality requires. Without truth, there's only power. The person with the best show wins. The person with the most money wins. But if you have a general respect for truth, then someone who's lying, if you have a culture that respects truth, then you can point out to someone that person's lying, and that person will be shamed. So a general respect for truth is required in order for someone who's less powerful to shame someone who's more powerful. So liberal democracy is a culture that requires, indeed centers upon truth. What Thrasymachus is saying in the Republic is that truth and justice have to go, and it's just power. And that is the basis. So I take it that philosophers, since Plato, have been fighting fascism. So one question I get all the time is, why a philosopher? Why a philosopher? You're not a historian. And my answer is, because that's our job. It's been our job since the beginning of Western philosophy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to describe 10 tactics of fascist politics. And you're going to notice that all of these tactics are in one form or another attacks on truth. Because fascism is about power, loyalty, and fear of the other. And all of these things, and because the other is not so scary, and power is threatened by truth, and loyalty is inconsistent, loyalty, truth, and truth and loyalty often conflict. You have to smash truth. So now you're going to notice also as I go on, the way I think of fascist politics and fascist ideology is it's a spectrum. So you can be more or less fascist. So fascism. So two warnings. First, you're going to see many things that are familiar from ordinary conservative politics in fascism. You see many things in the KKK familiar from ordinary conservative politics. Ordinary conservative politics, however, is not fascism. You'll see many things in democratic socialism, in Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, that are similar to communism, to authoritarian communism. But democratic socialism is not authoritarian communism. Both Elizabeth Warren and Mao want to take money from rich people. But Mao also wants to do a lot worse things than Elizabeth Warren. Both Hitler and social conservatives want more women to play traditional gender roles. But social conservatives do not want to eliminate minority populations. Social conservatives are not social Darwinists. So what you have, so you're going to see as I go through these tactics, you're going to see that, and I think what keeps social conservatives, democracy requires social conservatives, it requires libertarians, it requires democratic socialists. These are all democratically acceptable ideologies, and you need all of them around because problems are complicated and they have different solutions, and some problems are going to have free market solutions, and other problems are going to involve respecting tradition, and other problems are going to involve taking some money from rich people. So you don't know what. So you need all those people around. And I think all those doctrines have a respect for truth. But when you get to the extreme authoritarian doctrines, authoritarian communism and fascism, they're attacks on the truth. And I'm not going to be talking about authoritarian communism. But I will say this, there is no such thing as a liberal fascist. There is no such thing as a fascist feminist. Those are nonsensical. That doesn't mean that there aren't bad left-wing things. There are terrible left-wing things. Communism has killed probably more people than fascism. But there are different bad things in the world. And if you confuse bad things, then you won't know what bad thing you're facing. So you know, so there are different bad things. By fascism should not mean all the bad things. It's one kind of bad thing, and there are other kinds of bad things. Okay. So there are 10 chapters in my book corresponding to these 10 different central tactics of fascism. The first chapter is called The Mythic Past. Fascism always harkens back to a mythic past, a time when the country was great. For Mussolini, it was obviously the Roman Empire. It's a time for the Hindutva movement in India. They harken back to a time before there were Muslims, before there were Westerners, when there was the pure Hindu religion, which was harshly patriarchal. It didn't bring in, there was no homosexuality according to it. Women stayed home and bore children. You know, in the mythic past, in the fascist mythic past, is always harshly patriarchal. It always has very similar structure. Patriarchy, this is something that the scholars of fascism, Adorno in The Authoritarian Personality, Adorno, Elsa Frankel-Brunswick, and the other co-authors, they focus on the relationship between the patriarchal family and fascism. So there's a literature in social psychology about this, because in fascism, the fascist leader stands to the nation like the patriarchal father stands to his family. So in fascism, when the patriarchal father rules by strength, their authority comes from strength. In fascism, the leader is like the daddy. As I explained to my 3-year-old, the way I explain fascism to my 3-year-old is, in fascism, there's one big daddy. So one thing that is nice about the Nazis I shouldn't say that. Is that they're very explicit about stuff. So they were a very extreme version of the ideology I'm talking about. So Alfred Rosenberg, who is not Jewish, the Nazi ideologist, he says, he's very explicit, the past is a myth. The past is a myth, and the goal is to change the present. The goal is to make the dominant group feel like they've lost, to connect their feelings of anxiety and loss to a past that never was. To tell them, at one point, you were respected just because of your skin color. You were respected just because you're Hindu. You were respected just because, you're Rankine and not Rohingya, or just because you're Hutu. You were respected just because you were a man. And then connect people's anxiety to that. So the mythic past. So just a quick note, I'll stop contrasting with communism, but communism works by going towards a utopian future that never was. Fascism goes back to a mythic past that never was. Communism goes to an impossible future. The second feature is a certain kind of propaganda. Federico Finkelstein, who's an associate professor at the New School, a great young theorist of fascism, who does a lot of great work on South American fascism. He recently published this piece in Foreign Policy called Bolsonaro's Model is Not Trump, It's Goebbels. And in it he says, fascists always call their opponents what they are. So that is always standard. The Nazis said the mainstream press was lying all the time when they were lying. The Die Lügenpresse. You castigate the ordinary truth-telling institutions. You say universities are fascist ideological camps when you really have a cult of nationalism. So you reverse. Timothy Snyder, in his new book, The Road to Unfreedom, talks about what Putin does. He has this term schizofascism, because he calls it schizofascism. He says it's fascists calling anti-fascists fascists. He says it's all over Eastern Europe. They were calling Russian fascists, nationalists, who openly admired, Putin took a actual mid-century fascist and reburied him in the Kremlin, and reburied him in Moscow. Ivan Ilyich, I think. But he called Obama a fascist, and he called Angela Merkel a fascist. So what's going on with that? I mean, Angela Merkel, not a fascist. I mean, Putin, this joke did not go well in Ukraine when I spoke, but Putin, you're a nice guy, and I like you. I'm sure you're fine. Things are getting scary for anti-fascists. So that's a standard thing. You get the fascists always call, in fascist politics, you invert things. One thing that actually really surprised me, all fascist political campaigns are anti-corruption campaigns. 2011, Putin, who I'm sure is a nice guy, ran an anti-corruption campaign. Putin himself lives in modest means and is a man who lives only for his people. But by some, hey, they're laughing, not me. But some people have claimed that he has $200 billion that he keeps in other people's bank accounts. So Putin, if that were true, you might say Putin is the last person who should be running an anti-corruption campaign. Orban runs anti-corruption campaigns. Bolsonaro runs an anti-corruption campaign. The Nazis ran anti-corruption campaigns. This was something all over the that you see all over the literature on National Socialism. We think of the Nazis as these like pure anti-Semites, but in fact, a lot of them didn't care about killing Jews. They just wanted Jewish art and Jewish money. So this is a very anti-corruption here means something like the wrong people are in charge. Kate Mann, in her very important book Down Girl, talks about how in 2016 in the United States there was an election where, according to her, a very person who wasn't the soul of anti-corruption ran an anti-corruption campaign. I mean, the President Trump ran an anti-corruption campaign, right? Drain the swamp, against someone he called Crooked Hillary. So an inversion, Mann is saying that, like, what Kate Mann is saying is that when women seek power, they're corrupt just by doing that. So things mean their opposite in fascist politics. The third element is anti-intellectualism. Universities are attacked. The media is attacked. There's anything that deviates from the national narrative of glory of the nation is attacked. Like, here's a fact about history. Lots of different groups experience the same time. So in the United States, Black Americans, Mexicans, Mexican Americans, indigenous people, men and women, all went through the same time period, and it reacted to it in different ways. So if you're going to teach history, you're going to be teaching different reactions to the same time. If you're teaching history just as, and then Carnegie built this factory or whatever, or Carnegie, this mine was created and this museum, that's just one perspective, and that's not going to be history. So what you do is you attack multiple perspectives. You represent multiple perspectives as this attempt to take over. So you represent the attempt to give space for multiple narratives as an attempt to displace the dominant narrative. And that is an attack on truth. Fourth, hierarchy. So in liberal democracy, equality is an ideal. In fascism, hierarchy is an ideal. And hierarchy, well, so third is anti-intellectualism. Sorry, I'm skipping one. Fourth is unreality. So unreality is your attack, and unreality is the attack on truth. Conspiracy theories. It's always a mark of fascist politics with the spread of conspiracy theories. I actually stopped work. My first piece in the popular press in 2011 was on birtherism, because my parents are Holocaust survivors, and I grew up with close attention to signs. And I knew about the protocols of the Elders of Zion. And there's a common structure to conspiracy theories. This is what you do. You say, the media is owned by some shady forces. And you can tell that the media is owned by the shady forces because the media doesn't say it's owned by the shady forces. That was the protocol. That's what the Nazis did to the Die Lügenpresse. They said, the Jews own the media, and you can tell because the media refuses to report on the fact that the Jews own the media. That's how it works. How did birtherism work? President Trump came into politics. Birtherism starts in Russia. And then, as all good things do, so birtherism comes here. President Trump goes on Fox News and he says, CNN is run by Obama and all of these shady forces. You can tell because they're not reporting on the fact that Obama is not born in the United States. They're not allowing it to be seriously discussed. That's what you do. You delegitimize the mainstream media by creating a conspiracy and then saying the media is in on the conspiracy because they're not reporting on the conspiracy. That happens everywhere. So that's an attack on truth. There's also a way you can attack truth, which I know some of you have studied when you read Peter Pomerantsov's book about Russia, which is a great place. Nothing is true, everything is possible, where he talks about what RT does. What RT does is it represents every position. Like, you've got my team, like Democratic, I'm a leftist, Democratic Socialists, great. You've got some Nazis. You've got some Stalinists. You've got everybody on RT. You've got all, like, these far-right European sort of conspiracy theorists. You've got some sensible people. So you create this epistemic space where there's just chattering voices considering everything, and you don't know what to believe anymore. So you displace reality. So the next feature is hierarchy. So there's a kind of, hierarchy is a fascist ideal just like equality is a liberal ideal. In hierarchy, there's a dominant group. Men are higher than women, as Jair Bolsonaro said, who will probably be the next president of Brazil. He said, leader of Brazil, he said, I had 4 boys, he has 5 children, 4 boys, and his youngest child is a daughter. He said, I had 4 boys, and then when I grew weak, I had a daughter. So men are ranked over women, and the dominant group is ranked over other groups. You find this constant refrain in fascism, in fascist politics, that nature demands a hierarchy. So the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is written. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, Jews are behind all global movements. So before Israel, words like globalist and internationalist only had anti-Semitic connotations. This was before Israel, which came about in 1948. Because who were the people that were in Viktor Orban's recent words, at home, wherever they live, at home in Brussels, equally at home in Budapest and New York? They were us. I mean, me, I'm Jewish. But Israel changes that narrative. And Israel was designed to change that narrative. But we must remember, so now when people talk about globalists and internationalists, it's a bit separated from how it sounded in the 1930s. In the 1930s, no one had any doubt what it meant. It meant, the shady group that was behind communism and, bizarrely, capitalism at the same time were Jews. And that's what, in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, it says Jews spread liberalism, feminism, the doctrine of equality to undermine the dominant group. Because the idea in fascism is equality is a violation of nature. Equality is impossible. One group must rule. And so what we're doing, I mean, it's flattering. I wish we could be responsible for liberalism. But what Jews are doing is they're spreading the doctrine of liberalism. Protocol says it's sort of written as advice to other Jews. It's a forgery. What you should do is spread the doctrine of liberalism to Christians, and then they will willingly hand their power to you. And then you can seize it. So the idea is minority groups, when feminists are saying women should be equal, really, since equality is a myth, feminists are trying to take over. Have you heard that one? That's right out of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Because the idea is behind fascism is equality is a myth. One group must rule. So anyone who's pushing the doctrine of equality, of social justice, is just trying to take over. It's a facade for takeover. So hierarchy. People ask, actually James's father, Lee McIntyre, wrote a book on post-truth, and people ask, which is primary in fascist politics? Is it the attack on truth, or is it racism? It's a good question, right? Because, people are out there both attacking truth, and they're out there being racist. In fact, these are two sides of the same coin. Because here's a sad fact about humans. We all suck in roughly equal degrees. So racism only thrives on a steady diet of fake news. So racism, post-truth and racism are two sides of the same coin. So hierarchy is a myth. If you buy into hierarchy, you buy into the mythic past, you buy into conspiracy theories, these are all methods to detach you from the truth. So next, victimhood. In fascist politics, the dominant group is the victim of encroaching equality. All of Mein Kampf is this ode to German victimhood. In October 12, 2017, Viktor Orban gave the keynote address at the International Conference for the Persecution of Christians in Budapest. And he said, the most persecuted group in the world are Christians. In fascist politics, the dominant group, men are the victims of feminism. Christians are the victims of Hanukkah. So recently Steve Bannon, not Steve Bannon, I'm sorry, that was Tucker Carlson, said a couple days ago, Tucker Carlson said, well, what's wrong with nationalism? Gandhi was a nationalist, and this is right. You need to make a distinction between two kinds of nationalism, and this underlies victimhood. You need to make a distinction between nationalism that aims at equality. So if you think of India under colonial rule, their traditions were being stamped out. They were being subjugated. And what they sought was equality. But then there's nationalism of the dominant group. And nationalism of the dominant group does not seek equality, it seeks domination. Nationalism of the dominant group is what we're being asked to embrace right now. Okay, so what is the form in which the minority groups threaten us? Well, in the most straightforward form of the politics, it's they're criminals. The outgroup are criminals. Jews were criminals. The outgroup are two things. They're criminals and they're lazy all over the world. The outgroup are criminals and they're lazy. So all fascist campaigns are law and order campaigns. I'm going to go on for 4 more minutes. Who do I look? That's okay, 4 or 5. So for 5 minutes at most. So the outgroup men are criminals. The outgroup women are like invisible, and where they're visible, they're just like prostitutes. So you find this in black feminism, this theorized, the dual invisibility of black women and the hypervisibility of black women. The way that black women are not allowed into the patriarchy, they're not allowed to be wives and mothers. That's reserved for the in-group women. this is something that is universal. The Tutsi women, the Hutu 10 Commandments denounced the Tutsi women as, unfit to be wives and mothers. So all fascist campaigns are law and order campaigns. So here's a quiz. What crime does the outgroup do? Do the outgroup men do? What's their worst crime? Rape. The outgroup men are rapists. That's why the first fascist laws are always focused on illegalizing relations between the in-group women and the out-group men, right? Because the out-group men are rapists, and this raises your panic, the panic of the in-group men. They can't protect their women. They need a strong leader to help protect their women. So rape is always in Austria. The Minister of the Interior, who's a member of the Freiheitliche Partei Österreich, their fascist party, recently went around to all the police stations and said, you're not allowed to talk to Der Standard, which is their mainstream media outlet. And if you do talk to any media, you're only allowed you should highlight rapes of Austrian women by foreigners. So the next feature is sexual anxiety. All fascist movements raise panic about rape threats of foreign men, or the outgroup men. Of course, in our country, that was the basis of lynching. The myth, what Angela Davis calls the myth of the black rapist. They raise panic about homosexuality, because homosexuality is this tremendous threat to patriarchal values, especially male homosexuality. So the Nazis, of course, sent homosexuals to concentration camps, the Reichsministerium for Abort. The Nazis had some of the strongest penalties for abortion in any government, abortion for Aryan women. So because that sexual freedom is a kind of freedom, and fascist politics attacks freedom. It's transgender women are always the focus of the attack on fascist politics. I mean, I was in France giving one of these talks, and people were talking about the panic about transgender women there in certain times, and they're like, it's funny, nobody cares about transgender men. That's because choosing to be a woman violates patriarchal values, because you're supposed to choose to be a man. So there's Julia Serrano makes this point in her book, Whipping Girl. So chapter 9, Sodom and Gomorrah. I mean, the ninth print, the social basis, fascist politics attracts large support in cities, and one should never think otherwise. Or, if you drive through, but its social basis, the way it works, is it appeals to the heartland. Its primary social basis is in the rural areas. The real values, the social basis of the National Socialists, Erdogan's basis, the source of power of these authoritarian movements, of these fascist movements, comes from the rural areas, because the idea is those are the pure areas where the foreigners haven't infested. Chapter 2 of Mein Kampf is called My Time in Vienna, and Hitler's talking about going from his town, his idyllic, bucolic town, into Vienna, and he's like, foreigners everywhere, and Jews, and more Jews. In Europe, Jews are the hated foreign group is associated with cities. Cities are the places where people mix, the Jews and the non-Jews. The out-group lives in the cities. And in my country, the expression inner city means the place where our hated minorities live, right? So the ninth principle is Sodom and Gomorrah. The real rural heartland values are in the rural areas, and the cities have the degeneracy, the homosexuality, the hated minorities, the mixing. And the final chapter is called Arbeit macht frei, which was written on the gates of Auschwitz. Work shall make you free. What does this mean? Well, my colleague Timothy Snyder, German historian, Eastern European historian, he suggested this chapter title. He looked at me slyly and he said, you know, when white Americans say black people are lazy, that's what the Nazis meant by Arbeit macht frei. The idea is the outgroup are lazy, they're lazy by their nature, and they use the state to leech off you. The Jews were said to use banking to avoid any labor, mental or physical labor. The Nazi textbooks for elementary school students show soft hands, supposedly soft hands of Jews saying, never worked a day in their life. And then the idea is you need to force them to work for free to learn a work ethic. So the official goal of the concentration camps was you were going to force Jews to work for free to learn a work ethic. Similarly, you find Americans justifying the brutal mass incarceration of black Americans today by saying, well, why shouldn't they? You know, we're doing them a favor for incarcerating them for 30 years and making them work full jobs for 20 cents an hour. We're teaching them a work ethic. So think about that, and think about at the same time 9% of the world's prison population is black American. Maybe there's only one other time in history when that's been true, that such a large percentage of the world's prison population came from one ethnic group. And I think that's the Holocaust. So you take the minority group, you force them to work for free, and you say, it's good for them. It's teaching them a work ethic. And that's because at the foundation of Nazi ideology is the idea that Hitler's book is called My Struggle, is value comes from struggle and from winning. Social Darwinism is at the basis. And social Darwinism says your value comes from winning in a struggle. You know, those that work hard have value, and those who are lazy have not. So then you justify. So there's an overlap here between libertarianism and fascism. Libertarianism also says value comes from winning in a struggle. The difference between libertarianism and fascism takes the social Darwinism of libertarianism. As I say in my book, economic libertarianism is the dinner party face, Manhattan dinner party face of social Darwinism. But economic libertarianism is different from fascism in that economic libertarianism is always located in the individual, and the consistent economic libertarian should never move to groups and say, well, this group has more value because they work harder. And yet, there seems to be this inescapable mix. Like in Germany, the Alternative für Deutschland, the German fascist party, it emerges from libertarians. So it's somehow this illiberal way of thinking of value is coming from hard work, which we better get rid of before the machines do all the work. This creates this ideology where this feeds into this ideology where you think of value as based on hard work and being law-abiding, where these somehow inhere in groups. So that's my sketch of fascist ideology, and I think, so let me end on a quick note of hope. People ask me about hope. Here's the hope. Our country, fascism is not some foreign thing. It's here. It's always been here. If you listen to the history of political philosophy, it has long roots. But our country is a heroic example of the fight against fascism. If you look at the literature that black American intellectuals have created over the past 150 years, what have they been doing? They've been fighting fascism forever because they've been the victims. So what did Ida B. Wells do? When they've been fighting fake news, there's a long history of fighting fake news in the black intellectual tradition. Look at Ida B. Wells. You know, when people were mass lynching black Americans for supposedly their mass rape, she went around and she calculated all the reports of rape and compared them to the reports of lynchings in newspapers and pointed out that there were way more lynchings than rapes being reported. So it couldn't be that lynchings were because of rapes. Du Bois, Study of the Negro Problems, 1898, is responding to Frederick Hoffman's argument that black people will die out and become extinct. and he says, look, when you talk about black crime rates, you just talk about how this means that black people are violent. But then when you talk about the same crime rates among German Americans, you say it's because they don't have jobs, and you point to poverty. So we have this long history in the black American tradition. And when we think about fighting hard, think about where they did the civil rights movement. Personally, if I were going to do a civil rights movement, I would probably choose the Upper West Side of Manhattan or San Francisco. People fought the civil rights movement in Alabama and Mississippi in the 1960s. And if they can do that there, then nobody has any excuse about the difficulty of the task in front of us. Thank you.
Awesome. Now we have time for questions. Please raise your hand if you have a question. One of us will come to you with a mic. Priority will be given to students. And as a courtesy to your fellow guests, we ask that you please keep your questions brief. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I was hoping you could speak to the potential relation between patriotism and nationalism, how similar you think they are, if you think one leads to the other, or whatever you can say
Excellent.
about it.
So patriotism, patriotism can be a very positive thing because it's a relationship to a political entity. I'm a patriotic American. Both my parents sailed in boats past the Statue of Liberty and took me on the Staten Island ferry to be like, tell me about the first time they saw the Statue of Liberty. So, when I reflect on my patriotism is for a political entity, the United States, that represents certain values, liberty and equality. It is not to an ethnic identity. It's not to a religion. It's to a political entity, and that political entity is represented by a certain social compact. So patriotism, one version of patriotism is healthy. It's devotion to a particular, if the political entity has valuable ideals, like our country, I think, does, then patriotism is healthy. Nationalism is based on connection to an ethnicity, a religion, a heritage, and that I think it can be okay if it's nationalism in the service of equality, if you're just trying to preserve your traditions, if you're trying to say, look, you shouldn't stamp out my traditions. But if you want nationalism as a form of domination, it's never good.
My name is Umut. Thank you for your talk. So, this question may be a hard one to answer, and maybe it is one of the biggest dilemmas of our world. But we know the roots of our fascism, but how do we fight it?
Next question. No. We fight it. This is why, for a while, I was thinking of, maybe I'd move to Canada, and then someone said to me, there are no black Americans in Canada. Who's going to defend you? We have a long tradition here in this country. We just look to that. If you look to like fighting fake news, there's a long tradition of fighting fake news in this country. If you look at the 1930s, the 1930s was a time where we really almost went fascist. And I think that there's a certain kind of American patriotism here, for instance. I think that resisting nationalist, everyone likes to be told they're great. You have to resist that. You have to resist the sort of like, oh no, you are better. And you have to hold on to the truth. I really believe, I get corny about, like Du Bois in Black Reconstruction capitalizes truth. I think the truth will set you free. Like, we defend truth in the university. We need to defend truth. And And I mean, it's tricky, as we know, Carter G. Woodson in The Miseducation of the Negro points out how truth can mislead, like, you don't need that example. So the president calls angel families, families who've lost family members to immigrant crime, right? They're called like angel families or something. And then there's like this special commission for angel families. But hey, and it's true that those families have lost family members to crimes committed by immigrants. It's true. But immigrants have lower crime rates than non-immigrants. So you can use something true to convey something false. And so there's a sort of, there are difficulties about, there's a complexity about facing this kind of propaganda. But in general, we can look to our American past for successful fights. We can look to the civil rights movement.
Thank you. How do you define political equality?
Good. So I define, I give a much longer and more leftist answer in my book, How Propaganda Works. But the idea is that the basic answer is everyone has equal voice in the political sphere. And so everyone's points matter the most, matter equally. Now that's a fantasy given the role of money in politics here. So in my book, How Propaganda Works, I argue that you can't have this role of money in politics and have a democratic society with real political equality, that the role of money in politics subverts, corrupts, and makes impossible political equality. So you need strong campaign finance laws, but of course we're using freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is being used by the courts now, as in the Janus decision and the Citizens United decision, to undermine political freedom, political equality, because they're like, they're giving extra voice to corporate interests. So yeah, political equality requires everyone having equal voice, and that's going to be very difficult when you can have large differences in money, but you better prevent them from infecting the public sphere. And of course, the courts have made that impossible.
So you said that the truth will set you free, and the truth is like liberates fascism. So it seems like for us to have truth, we need this like supreme source of truth. And right now, our news media outlets are polarized. How do you think that relates to a politics be able to undermine the source of truth, and how that lead how can we find truth with the polarized media?
Right. So there's always, I mean, I think we should resist. Look, I think when you say I'm kind of resistant to this notion of polarization because, and it's true that polarization, you look at the history of National Socialism, and polarization was much more extreme there. But what happened was that the Nazis successfully painted the center-left as extremists. And so I'm worried that your question goes along with the assumption that, oh my God, the New York Times are communists. The New York Times are, the New York Times are definitely not communists. they're the New York Times, the CNN and the New York Times. I mean, do I love those media outlets? No, but not because, I've been fighting to get more left-wing stuff in those media outlets for years, and it's very, very difficult. They're very, very, they're not polarized, but they're still at fault because they make money off what's happening. So they make money off of spectacle, which is another problem, which is a different problem. I don't think polarization is the problem with our newspapers. I think it's a problem with Fox News, of course, but I think the problem with CNN and New York Times and those outlets is that they, maybe especially CNN, is it focuses on making money. And when your news outlets are focusing on making money, then they're not focusing on giving you the truth, they're giving you on what makes money. So like, Donald Trump got billions of dollars in free media. He's a master at this because like, oh, is something gonna happen at a Trump rally? Is somebody gonna get punched? And like, everyone is making money off this sensational stuff. And that's the problem, not polarization. So, you know, as Arendt emphasizes, in a healthy democratic society, politics should be dull and boring. It's, you know, it's like, oh my God, they're giving us 7 apples. They want to say 4.5. Like, it should be boring. It's really bad when politics is this exciting. And I think the problem with news media outlets, Fox, yeah, it's propaganda outlet. And the way Fox talks, that mocking, sneering way in which they talk, that's a very disturbing way to be a media outlet. But the problem with New York Times and CNN is that they can be toadies of the government at times as well, like during the Iraq War. And they can be sensationalist driven and not focusing on sort of boring investigative reporting. But if you want a good example of good investigative reporting, look at the 18-month New York Times investigation of Trump's finances, which was, I mean, but the problem was nobody cares. Nobody cares, because, so it's not really the media, it's us. Because we're all like, no, we'd rather find out about the sensational stuff.
Hi, Professor Stanley. Thanks so much for coming. My friends and I, through one of our classes with Professor Martin, which I believe is in the crowd, read your book, How Propaganda Works. So it's really cool to see you in person. I wanted to ask you about kind of the role of social media in fighting fascism. So it seems as if social media can have both constructive and destructive effects when you look at...
As we've seen.
yeah, when you look at the Arab Spring, it was able to spread information, which led to fascist leaders being toppled. But when you look at Trump getting elected, it also allowed for a platform through which false information was disseminated. So I'm wondering, in the scheme of things, do you see social media and kind of a lack of accountability in spreading information as a destructive or constructive effort in fighting fascism?
So one thing I do in my book is I talk about how very similar things happened in earlier eras. So, you know, in the 1920s, and How Fascism Works, I talk about how in the 1920s the German government had a propaganda campaign about the Black Horror on the Rhine. And the Black Horror on the Rhine was French Senegalese soldiers occupying the Rhineland. And so they spread this stuff about how, like, oh, they're raping German women. And there was even a rally of 10,000 people in Madison Square Gardens in New York City in the 1920s to protest the Black Horror on the Rhine. And that was a couple years before Facebook. So these propaganda campaigns can happen in absence of social media. But what social media does, I mean, my colleague Tim Snyder is arguing that he has this provocative line, you know, social media is fascist, because it breaks apart truth. And so there is no, like, what you did have at one point was you had a common narrative that people could share. And as Walter Lippmann argued, that can be dangerous at times, but you know, you had Walter Cronkite, when you have all these diverse sources, it suggests there's no like common reference point. And when there's no common reference point and you can pick and choose, that raises epistemic problems. Liam Kofi Bright, a young philosopher, calls it epistemic apartheid, like, you know, everyone in their epistemic corners. And so social media can raise that epistemological worry. And it also destroys privacy. Liberalism requires privacy. If there's no privacy anymore, how can there be a distinction between the public and the private, which is required by liberalism?
Hi, thank you for coming to speak. You mentioned Plato's Republic, and kind of looking at Plato's Republic, where you have a philosopher king, right, like the leader of truth and reason, you also have the auxiliaries who are trained then to create this otherness.
Yeah, I'm not promoting Plato's Republic.
I know. But to create this otherness to protect the city, and I guess I'm just wondering, moving that kind of model to liberal democracy, when would you find, if there is any time, the role of creating otherness in a liberal democracy in the effort to protect liberal democracy? Is that ever justified?
To create otherness?
Yes, this idea of, okay, like talking about nationalism, you know, we look
Right.
to nationalism maybe in two ways. One, associated with difference, such as isms of sexism, racism,
Right.
fascism,
Yeah.
and the other of oneness of this idea of a shared history. So I guess maybe the heart of the question is, what role does nationalism play in a liberal democracy, if any role at all, in creating an otherness, which seems hypocritical to a liberal democracy, but maybe is sometimes needed in order to protect the liberal democracy itself?
Okay, so I wouldn't say that the role of the military in the Republic in Gallipolis is that they're other. They're just, everybody has a role to play in this society, and we philosophers, we get to rule, but we get no private property. So I'd rather have the private property. But so I don't think that the people like the soldiers are other. I think that Plato is actually quite correct in Book 8 when he says that, you know, he has these incredible passages about liberal democracy, about democracy, where he's like, in democracy, equality spreads. You know, I mean, it's anachronistic to call it liberal democracy, but in democracy, equality spreads. One can expect there to be equality between students and their teachers. So there will be student protests. One can expect there to be equality between foreigners and citizens. So what he's saying is that in democracy, equality spreads so much that there isn't otherness anymore. And, you know, and if, so I think, you know, that is sort of, I'm kind of a liberal Democrat by religion or whatever. So I think that there's no, I think, you know, I think borders are, you know, I think of borders as sort of preconditions for states rather than part of the state. I think Carl Schmitt is right, the Nazi political theorist, that there's, you know, liberal democracy, you know, there's going to be sort of like non-liberal democratic aspects that you're just going to have to accept about liberal democracy. Like Schmitt basically is like, how can you have a nation state that's a liberal democracy? Because, you know, you're going to have to violate the universal dignity of. So, you know, I mean, ultimately, I think you would go for small states that are equal to each other, where one is not dominating the other. That would be the idea. That would be the ideal liberal democratic world, not one government. I agree with Hannah Arendt that you can never have one government, because where would the refugees go? But you know, but you can have many states with borders, but it's not like one state dominates the other state. That would be the model. And then you don't have to feel anyone as other.
All right, we'll now have time for one more question.
Nice, I get the last question. Thank you so much for your talk. Hi, guys. It was really informative. I'm actually here with a bunch of high school students, so
awesome.
Having an impact on a younger population. They're embarrassed now that I'm saying that about them. My question for you is, you mentioned earlier Federico Finkelstein, and he talks a lot about the distinction between fascism and populism. And tonight you've given a number of characteristics that explain how Donald Trump feels fascist. Would you describe him more aptly as a fascist or as a populist?
I think, well, let me be clear that when I talk about Trump as a fascist, I'm not talking about the United States having a fascist regime, because I'm talking about fascist politics and fascist ideology. And I don't think there's any question that he uses those tactics, that he uses, and that he's kind of into power. But yeah, I think that I think Finkelstein, people have tried to get me and Finkelstein to debate, but I think that Finkelstein, I think people, I think there's a couple sort of obstacles to saying Trump is fully engaged in fascist politics. But there are also reasons to look at our 1930s and say the same thing. Number one, he doesn't openly call for eliminating democratic institutions. On the other hand, what you see in Eastern Europe now is this new formation where Orban and even Putin have the facade of democratic elections. So you don't really know. He's not openly calling for the kind of extrajudicial killing of opponents. He's only calling, I guess, to imprison them. But you know, I think I don't like the term populism. I think the term populism is vacuous. It means nothing. Like, you know, I've been to these conferences where people are talking about Hitler and Bernie Sanders, and I really feel like that's like if you find yourself with a concept that includes both Hitler and Bernie Sanders, you took a really wrong turn somewhere. So I think the concept of populism is an empty concept. It doesn't cut social reality at its joints, and I think that fascism is a concept that does cut social reality at its joints. And if we can just get rid of our tendency to use fascism as just like any bad thing, then, you know, it can be useful again.
That's all the time that we have for questions. Please join me in thanking our speaker, Jason Stanley.